So one way to imagine small nanotube networks with functionalized tubes, nanotubes, sensing multiple targets inserted into a cell in vivo. By in vivo means we live inside living organisms. In vitro is outside living organism, just in the lab environment on a plate. Information from each nanotube sensor can be fused within the network, and it differs from today's less efficient approaches using carbon nanotube networks to construct the transistors for the wireless devices. Molecular communication is one way of enabling nanoscale machines to communicate using molecules as the information carrier signal. So inside the biological systems, the communication is typically done through the transport of these molecules. So somehow by sending the molecules, that's my signal, and I can encode the information onto various aspects of this signal. We'll be discussing how to do it in much more detail in the following chapters. This can include a broad spectrum of approaches, like inside the cell, you can transport the information by using the vesicle transports. Remember I mentioned the molecular motors carrying these vesicles full of messenger molecules. Another way could be intercellular communication through the neurotransmitters, like the neural system inside your body, or between the organs inside the body using hormones. Also outside the body using hormones, like between the animals, like the ants or the cats, dogs also communicate using the hormones. So these are in longer distances. There are multiple fundamental research issues here, like controlling the propagation of these signal carrier molecules, encoding and decoding of information onto these signals, and achieving transmission and reception of the carrier and information molecules. So we can simply say our goal is to transmit over tens of micrometers distance using these molecules, like using the molecular motors, hormones, messenger molecules, or neurotransmitters. Information can be encoded using proteins, ions, amino acids, or DNA molecules. The environment is typically assumed to be an aqueous solution, typically that of the what we call the thermal bath between the cells, so found within or between the biological cells in a living organism. And the analogy will become reality, hopefully, in several decades. And unfortunately, the computer and network viruses may literally now be biological viruses again. Some sample applications could be, what? Finally some images, right, okay. Just inserted last time. For example, you can make use of some lipid detectors inside the body to detect the lipid level of a human being against, for example, heart attacks. So that could be used for health monitoring. Another one could be, as of today, you have this. Okay, you can have prosthetic limbs attached to a human's body, and you try to provide the ability to hold something to a person who has lost his or her arms. That's great, but it's not very practical. You cannot expect a person to continue with his daily life with such a mechanism. Anybody has any idea what this is? This is, it's not real, of course. This is from a movie. This is the right hand provided as a prosthetic limb to Luke Skywalker in Star Wars after he lost his right arm during the fight with Darth Vader. Darth Vader himself also had lost his right arm and 2 legs. Another one, this guy, this time not from Star Wars, but this one is from Star Trek, this time, Geordi LaForge. In the movie again, the guy is blind, but with the help of these glasses, the cameras on the device convert the signal and then send it to his brain to form the image. Currently, there are such projects. People are working on such projects to come up with ways of doing this. Of course, we don't have it yet, but that could be done. So you can have advanced synthetic eyes that enable sight under low light conditions. By the way, this might also look very futuristic to you, but about 10 years ago, maybe even more, there was a guy, I should look up his name. I remember his name. His name was Kevin, but I forgot his last name. I will just look it up. The guy had a chip embedded inside his arm. He was a university professor, so that he could record the signals going from the brain to the arm. So when you decide to move your arm, what kind of signals does the brain send to the muscles here? The second phase of the project was embedding a similar chip in his wife's arm and having wireless communication in between. So that when he thought about moving his arm, his wife would, in an unwilling manner, would move her arm or fingers, whatever. Okay. I'm not sure about the current status of the project, but if you can manage this, now this guy, this Professor Kevin, can just sit and think about cleaning the house, and his wife unwillingly will start cleaning the house. But that's the joke side of it. But we're not too far to such things. That's what I'm trying to explain. Okay? Because doing the mechanical systems that will act as a finger or a hand, that's already done. We have done it for the robots at the moment. The problem is somehow attaching this to the human body. And this is also partly done. Not in a very good manner, but it's partly done. If we can do the transition in that interface between the limb and the nerve system, if you can understand the signal that's coming through the nerve and convert it to electric signals that will move the fingers, and also in the reverse direction, when you try to hold something, if you assume that you're trying to hold an egg, if you hold it tight enough, you should stop. So you should have the feeling. When you feel the sufficient pressure to understand that, yes, you have sufficiently hold it, and you shouldn't go any further, you should be able to send the signal back to the brain in a way that the brain will understand it like your own arm and say, okay, that's the time to stop. If you can manage this, that would be perfect. Not today, maybe, but in several cases. That's very important. Now, this is the thing I was mentioning here. This is a military device used for biological and chemical detection. If I remember correctly, this device was something like 1.2 kilograms. But besides being heavy, by the time it realizes that there has been an attack, maybe it will not have killed the people in the room, but it will have given sufficient damage to the people. We would like to do it at the nanoscale as much as possible. Does it sound like science fiction? To most people it does, but not exactly. Especially now, when we talk about nano devices composed in what we call the bottom-up approach, people find it more realistic. Now, there are three different approaches in nanotechnology. These are bottom-up, top-down, and biohybrid. The top-down is taking MEMS, microelectromechanical systems, and making them even smaller. That's what the current technology is doing with microprocessors, for example. Making it smaller and smaller and smaller. So you're going from the larger scale to the smaller scale. So if you go far enough, you will end up with the nanoscale. That's one approach. Fine. They're working on it. That's one line in research. Another line of research is bottom-up. There they start with several atoms, bring several atoms and molecules together, and they try to build machines out of it. I believe that is the best approach. That's the approach that will give the best results in the far future. It's a very nice approach, but it will take a long time to do it. At the moment, they have been able to build gears that turn each other. The gears are made of several atoms, and one gear pushes the other, so if you give a kinetic moment to one, the other one also turns. That's great, but nothing useful at the moment. These are, at the moment, toy systems in the laboratory that are working as proof of concept, but it's not something useful for the daily user at the moment. And the third approach, so one is top-down, the other is bottom-up, and the third approach is going this way, which is the biohybrid approach. The nature is already doing this, let's just try to control it. So we're trying to come up with engineered cells that are actually cells but modified in such a manner that we can control it. That happens to be the most early promising approach. With that, you will be closer to a useful system in the shortest term. Meanwhile, other approaches may come up with other solutions. And they're not necessarily enemies or alternatives to each other. You can have them together working. That's also possible. Okay, so it's not like you should either go this way or that way. You can have both. But when we talk about that biohybrid approach, people always take this futuristic. Is it really futuristic? When I started this topic, the first thing I had in mind was implementing an adder. Because if you can do the addition, you prove that you can do many things. Okay? But I figured out that it was late. They've already done the half adder and full adder as early as 2004 and 2005, respectively. Even full adder is done. Benson has proved that that DNA strands and enzymes can be used to build a Turing machine. It's a hypothetical approach because it's a Turing machine, but he has proven that it could be done. Are these few crazy guys working on this? No. As I said, IEEE has a standard group working on this. IEEE Spectrum magazine has biological transistors as the cover story of the March 2011 issue. And research is going this way. Another approach could be making use of quantum effects, which include tunneling the diodes, single electron transistors, and quantum dots. And one important thing is that quantum devices are sensitive to noise, and you can utilize it. Quantum devices enable the use of quantum cryptographic techniques to improve the information assurance. As early as 1984, the quantum BB4 quantum key distribution scheme has been developed for cryptography. It's probably secure and relying on the quantum property that information gain is only possible at the expense of disturbing the signal. If the states we're trying to distinguish are not orthogonal, they're benefiting from that. And the quantum approaches to information assurance are growing rapidly for both macroscale and nanoscale networks. Going back to the sensor network analogy, consider the sensor nodes. They're small and potentially mobile devices. From the perspective of traditional computer networking, the sensor nodes are resource limited. They don't have too much processing power. They don't have too much storage for memory. They don't have sufficient battery. They have smaller antennas, so their transmission ranges are shorter and more concerns. But the sensor networks have been designed as evolutionary offshoots of the traditional computer networking devices. The smallest wireless sensor node is approximately 1 cubic centimeter in volume, and the sensing element within this device is a considerable part of it. Actually, the sensing component typically is one of the largest parts in a sensing node. So people are proposing making use of carbon nanotubes to make these sensing elements. But what you do for the communication side, you need to also do something on the communication side. So compare and contrast what we have learned from sensor networks and how can we apply it now in the nanoscale. How can we benefit from that information? So according to our nanonetworking definition, the entire nanonetwork shrinks to the same scale as today's actual sensing element. The sensing element that is being used for the sensing operation here. According to our nanonetworks definition, the devices do not have to be always sensing nodes. But making use of sensing happens to be one of the most applicable application areas for this. And the entire network will fit at the same scale as the target you're trying to sense. That's very important. If you're trying to sense something going on very small scale, but your device is huge, you will not be able to sense it. But when you go to the nanotechnology, now you're at the same scale, so you can do it in a more effective manner. When we are moving from the classical internet towards the sensor networks, the size of the host nodes are typically reduced, and you will have more nodes in a smaller area. A high concentration of nodes in a very small area. This has its benefits, and it also comes with its own problems. Like if you have more nodes in an area, it's easier to sense. It's more probable that you will find the element you're sensing for. Also, you will find some neighbors to communicate with. But the problem goes as you have so many neighbors that, for example, medium access will be a trouble. Or you will have too much interference. You have to cope with these. The increase in the node density is greater than linear when the scale changes. And the physical topology of the network now tends to be much different compared to the classical ones. According to the classical internet, you have some important nodes, and around those nodes you have other nodes accumulated. And those important nodes either tend to be servers providing information to those nodes in the environment, or they tend to be, for example, the routers, which are concentrating all the traffic from those nodes in the environment and carrying them with a high capacity link. In the case of sensor networks, things are different. First of all, we're talking about an asymmetric flow. Information is directed towards one or few collection points, which we call the sinks. This is much different from the classical internet approach. The internet topology forms a scale-free structure, and that's how actually the internet has been able to spread worldwide by having these clusters of nodes. So there are few highly concentrated nodes, and many nodes have much fewer connections. There are few nodes that have many outgoing links, but most of the nodes have one or two or three outgoing links. If you look at a node which has many connections, let's say k connections, where k is a number between m, small k is between m and bigger k. These are the minimum and maximum number of connections. Now, and c is a normalization factor, and lambda is the power law exponent. Then if you try to plot k, which is the probability of a node having k connections, that fits a negative sloping straight line, which means the number of nodes with large number of connections is much different from, is much lower compared to the number of nodes having small number of connections. However, when you consider the sensor networks, they typically look like a star topology, and all paths lead to that same node or nodes. In case of nanoscale networks, we should anticipate their use for both node-to-node communication and also as sensor networks. However, we should remember that the definition of the nanonetworks requires the ability to handle mobile nanoscale nodes also. So you should add the dimension of motion dynamics into the design of the network. The physical properties at the cellular scale are much different than those in the human scale. As we said, the physics is actually changing. Now the surface forces are becoming more important. And the motion patterns will also be significantly different. Like if you have a fluid flow, like the blood, now that flow of the fluid also needs to be considered. That's not the case for regular networks. One of the biggest challenges and the most important lessons when we try to scale down into the nanoscale is the constraint imposed by power consumption. Power can no longer be taken for granted because previously we never cared about the power. We always looked at link capacity, for example. But what happens to power? So even if you have more link capacity, you may not have enough power to communicate. So you should also take that into account. For the case of laptops, for example, in the case of MANETs, mobile ad hoc networks, we were somewhat considering the battery power. When we went to sensor networks, now power became more important. For the case of nanoscale networks, power is much more important. It may limit your transmission rate, for example. So batteries are typically relatively large storage devices, and they're difficult to scale. So much more effort should be spent for working on the energy density of the batteries, or ways of energy scavenging to deal with this power problem. So energy scavenging is a method for sensor networks. Mostly people have considered, for example, solar power. But in many applications, the nodes fall into the positions on the ground that do not get the sunlight, so it doesn't always work. In the case of biological systems, the energy source could be different. Actually, the cells in your body are getting the energy from the environment. Not, of course, from the air, but from the blood flow in your body. So if you can insert an engineered cell also to this environment, that can also get the energy, do energy scavenging in the same manner. Okay? So you can benefit from that. One other important thing is, if you look at the biological systems, they're really masters of energy efficiency. The molecular motors we discussed are more energy efficient compared to any man-made machine. The cell knows when to communicate. If the cell knows that it will not benefit from sending some information, it doesn't. It's so strange. It's reusing everything. When a cell dies, all the molecules that are released from that cell are reused by the other cells in the environment. The cell sends some messenger molecules, then recollects them and sends them once again. It's extremely energy efficient. Oops, did I skip the slide? No. If you, now this slide is more about sensor networks. Anybody took, I guess, no, did you take sensor networks course? Do you remember MECN? No, okay. When we discuss this, maybe you will remember. This is mostly related to what we have learned from sensor networks. There's an optimum energy efficient distance between the hops from the global perspective. The idea is the following. I'm trying to communicate with, let's say, Mustafa, who's at the other end of the room. One thing I can do is I can shout, which means I spend more energy so that he can hear me, or I can speak with a lower volume to Sanem, and Sanem can talk to, let's say, Yavuz, and then Yavuz tells it to Turu. Now, if I do that, first of all, as person, Tuna Tugcu, I'm spending less energy because I'm not shouting to a longer distance, let's say. But as the overall system, Tuna talks, Sanem talks, and Yavuz talks. Is this a clever idea or not? You should look at the distances. For some cases, this is better. For some other cases, it's not. So there's some characteristic distance at which using relays, after which using relays is more meaningful. But for shorter distances, rather than using relays, just talk louder and let the destination hear you. Okay. So this thing has already been discussed and studied for the case of sensor networks, which could be also useful for us here. So I have several slides to discuss, but this will take time. We'll not be able to finish these in such a short time. So let me stop today at this point. It's 5 minutes to 5 o'clock. And next week, I will continue from here and finish this chapter. And then start with the more interesting part of it. Next week will be, I will try to add more onto these slides also. And once we're finished with this chapter, We will also start next week the topic of intracellular communications. We will not be able to finish it next week. I'm not sure if we will be able to finish it the following week either. So that will probably take us more than 2 weeks. So we have few chapters, but our chapters are a little bit longer. So we'll be spending several weeks on each chapter, especially on chapters 2 and 3. We'll be spending several weeks. Okay, so, but at least next week we'll be starting the interesting part of it. This week was totally aimed at telling you a little bit about what we are going to do in this course. That's all. And I hope somehow you found it interesting.